Hey everyone. Tonight we're going to slip into the dark streets of Los Angeles in the mid-1980s. Picture this. The city buzzes with neon lights, palm trees swaying in the hot air, and music pulsing from radios. But tucked between the glamour and sunshine, something horrifying is happening. Women are disappearing, only to be found later dumped in alleys, left in dumpsters, their bodies discarded like trash. It's the kind of story where you know, deep down, you're probably not going to survive this if you stumble into it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. Now, turn off the lights and let's enjoy tonight's journey together. The story begins in South Los Angeles, a part of the city already struggling with poverty, crime, and a tense relationship between residents and law enforcement. In 1985, people in the neighborhood started noticing something terrifying. Women, mostly young, many of them vulnerable, were vanishing. Soon their bodies began to surface, left in public places, often shot or strangled. At first, the deaths seemed isolated. A tragic coincidence here, another one there. But the reality was far darker. The killer had a pattern. He targeted women, many of whom were sex workers or dealing with addiction people society too often ignored. That was part of why he was able to operate so easily. These women weren't seen as important cases to solve quickly. Their lives mattered, but the system didn't always treat them that way. And the killer knew it. He struck in areas where police presence was thin, where cries for help went unheard. Imagine walking through those neighborhoods back then. The streetlights are dim, shadows stretching long across broken sidewalks. Rumors start to spread. Women whisper to each other about someone out there, a man with a gun, a man who doesn't stop at robbery. But fear is slippery. It blends into the background noise of a city already on edge. People are used to danger. They don't yet realize what's brewing is something worse than the usual street crime. By late 1985, at least half a dozen women had been found dead under eerily similar circumstances. Bodies were discovered dumped in alleys or inside trash bins, stripped of dignity, often with evidence of sexual assault. Some were shot with the same small caliber handgun. Others were strangled. The method was cold, repetitive, and clinical in its cruelty. And just like that, a serial killer was born in Los Angeles, though few realized it yet. The press hadn't caught on. Police reports were scattered, the murders investigated by different departments without being connected. This wasn't the age of instant databases and cross-department alerts. Communication between law enforcement groups was slow and clumsy. Detectives worked their cases in isolation, unaware their colleagues across town were staring at the same nightmare. That blind spot gave the killer freedom to keep striking. For the families, each murder was devastating. Mothers lost daughters, children lost mothers, sisters lost sisters. But because many of the victims lived on society's margins, their deaths rarely made headlines. That silence added to the pain. People wanted answers, but they weren't getting them. Meanwhile, the killer watched, confident that nobody could trace him. Think about it. In the mid-80s, DNA forensics wasn't yet the magic bullet it would become. Investigations leaned heavily on witness statements, fingerprints, and the occasional lucky break. But this killer was cautious. He left little behind, other than the bodies themselves. His weapon of choice, a .25 caliber handgun, didn't scream serial killer to detectives at first. It just looked like another violent crime in a city full of them. Still, the murders piled up. By 1987, it was impossible to ignore that something systematic was happening. The bodies were too similar, the killings too precise. Some detectives began to whisper about a predator out there, but without solid evidence, the theory didn't gain traction publicly. To admit a serial killer was prowling South Los Angeles would have been to admit that countless women were in danger and that the police hadn't been able to protect them. That kind of admission didn't come easily. Meanwhile, in the neighborhoods, the fear grew. Women were afraid to walk alone at night. Some carried weapons for protection. Others avoided the streets altogether after dark. But the killer didn't stop. He was like a shadow that slipped in and out unnoticed, blending into the background noise of the city. To his neighbors, he was just another face, maybe even a friendly one. No one suspected that behind closed doors, he carried the darkness of a predator. The murders stretched into 1988. each one echoing the same horrifying pattern. The police were now dealing with a collection of unsolved cases, each one screaming for attention, but no leads, no suspects. And then, just as abruptly as it started, the killings seemed to vanish. The city exhaled, thinking maybe the storm had passed, but those who had been paying close attention knew better. Predators like this don't just stop. They wait, they watch, and they come back when the time feels right. That's the nightmare we're stepping into tonight. A story that begins with discarded lives in back alleys and ends with a discovery so shocking it forced Los Angeles to face its deepest fears. And as the curtain rises on this grim tale, we're left with one question hanging in the air. Who was the man lurking in the shadows, and why did it take so long to catch him? The late 1980s in Los Angeles were already turbulent gang violence, the crack epidemic, and growing distrust between communities and the police. It was the perfect storm for a predator to hide in plain sight. Between 1985 and 1988, a terrifying series of killings carved through South Los Angeles. This was the first wave of what would eventually be called the Grim Sleeper murders, though at the time, nobody had a name for him. The victims during this early period shared haunting similarities. They were almost all black women, many living on the margins, struggling with poverty, some caught in addiction, some involved in sex work. They were women whose lives were just as valuable as anyone's, but whose deaths didn't command front-page headlines. That's part of what allowed the killer to thrive. When the city looked away, he stepped closer. By the numbers, the killings were chillingly consistent. The bodies of at least 10 women were found, most dumped in alleys or stuffed into trash bins as if their lives had been tossed away with the garbage. Many bore signs of sexual assault. Some were strangled, but most were killed with a .25 caliber handgun. The weapon wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud. It was practical, small, and deadly, just like the man behind it. The details painted a clear picture of a serial predator. But the Los Angeles Police Department didn't quite connect the dots. This was before the days of integrated databases, where forensic evidence and case notes could be shared instantly between divisions. One department might be investigating a strangled woman in an alley, while another across town was puzzling over a shooting victim in a dumpster. The similarities slipped through the cracks. That disconnect wasn't just bureaucratic, it was deadly. Every time the cases weren't linked, the killer had room to strike again. Investigators were buried under the weight of everyday violent crime, and the lives of women from marginalized communities didn't bring the same resources as more high-profile cases. The unspoken truth? If the victims had been middle-class women from another part of Los Angeles, the city would have sounded the alarm sooner. Meanwhile, the killer honed his methods. He seemed to know which victims were most vulnerable, which alleys were the quietest, which dumpsters weren't checked often. He was methodical, but also careful not to stand out. That's what made him so dangerous. He wasn't the kind of predator who taunted the press or left messages for police. He didn't crave recognition, he craved control, and he fed it with silence. By 1987, families of the victims were beginning to sense that something larger was happening. They spoke out, desperate for the cases to be taken seriously. Mothers begged for answers. Sisters pleaded for justice. Community activists pointed out the obvious. These weren't random killings. Someone was hunting women in South Los Angeles. But their voices were often drowned out by the larger chaos of the city. It was too easy for officials to dismiss them as coincidences in neighborhoods already labeled dangerous. Even so, whispers of a serial killer began to ripple through the streets. Women shared warnings with each other. Don't walk alone at night. Don't get into strangers' cars. Don't trust the wrong smile. Fear crept into every interaction. Every unknown man could be him. Every shadow at night could hide the gun. And then came the discovery of yet another body, dumped carelessly like the others. Each crime scene was another reminder of how invisible these women were to the system that was supposed to protect them. And each time police failed to connect the evidence, the killer's confidence grew. He had found the perfect cover, a city distracted by its own chaos. At the time, the term Grim Sleeper didn't exist. But his legend was already forming in the dark, to the families, to the women living in fear. He was the monster who haunted their streets. The newspapers were slow to notice, but inside South Los Angeles, everyone knew something was very, very wrong. Still, no arrest came, no composite sketch hit the news, no warnings went out citywide. The women kept dying, their cases shuffled into stacks of other unsolved files. The killer was winning. And then, in 1988, the murders suddenly stopped. Just like that. After 3 years of carnage, the alleys grew quiet. The dumpsters no longer gave up their grim secrets. People didn't know whether to breathe easier or to stay on edge. Because predators like this don't just vanish. They go quiet for a reason. They wait. They change. They watch. But in that moment, Los Angeles didn't know they were living in the middle of a pause, not an ending. They thought maybe the nightmare had burned itself out. Maybe the killer had moved on, or been locked up for something else. No one could guess that this silence would stretch on for more than a decade, and that when he finally returned, the city would be unprepared all over again. The early killings, those bodies left in alleys, those lives ended without justice, were the foundation of a story that would haunt Los Angeles for decades. They were also a warning, one the city failed to heed. The man responsible wasn't finished, he was only sleeping. For 3 chilling years, women in South Los Angeles lived with the shadow of a predator stalking their streets. Then, in 1988, the killings suddenly stopped. No warning, no explanation, just silence. It was like the city had been holding its breath, waiting for the next body to show up, and then nothing. The community didn't know whether to feel relief or dread. For investigators, the lull was baffling. Serial killers don't usually quit. The psychology of compulsion suggests they're driven to keep going, to repeat their crimes until something stops them: death, prison, or capture. And yet, here was a man who had already killed at least 10 women, who had followed a clear pattern, who seemed unstoppable. Then, poof, gone. This pause stretched into years. Not just 1 or 2, but 14 long years. 14 years without another alleyway discovery, without another victim linked to the same pattern. For the people who had lost daughters, sisters, and mothers in the first wave, the silence was frustrating. No justice had been served, no answers had been given. The cases went cold, gathering dust in file cabinets. And the families were left to wonder if the killer was out there walking free, living a normal life while they mourned. Think about that for a second. 14 years is enough time for a kid to grow into a teenager. It's enough time for neighborhoods to change, for people to move away, for memories to fade. In the world of true crime, 14 years is an eternity. And yet, that's exactly what happened. The predator earned his eventual nickname during this time, the Grim Sleeper. It wasn't because he was caught napping, it was because he appeared to take this unnerving extended break. Why the pause? That question has haunted investigators and criminologists ever since. Some believe he may have been busy with his personal life. Lonnie Franklin Jr., the man later unmasked as the Grim Sleeper, lived like any other neighbor during these years. He worked as a mechanic. He attended block parties. He blended in so seamlessly that nobody suspected him of being the monster they feared. It's possible that family responsibilities, health issues, or just a desire to lay low after attracting too much heat forced him to stop. Others speculate he might not have stopped at all. Maybe there were more victims during those missing years, but their cases were never connected to him. Remember, back then, DNA testing wasn't widely used, and record-keeping was fragmented across different police departments. If he changed his methods, different weapon, different victim type, his crimes might have slipped under the radar completely. Some families still believe their loved ones from the 1990s could have been Grim Sleeper victims, but those names never officially made it onto the list. During this long gap, life in Los Angeles moved on, at least on the surface. The 1990s brought riots, political scandals, and a flood of crime stories that dominated headlines. The old killings faded into the background. For many, they were nothing but unsolved tragedies tucked away in forgotten neighborhoods. The killer had become part of the city's invisible history, a nightmare pushed into the past. But the truth was, he wasn't gone. He was there the whole time, hiding in plain sight. Imagine living on the same block as him, chatting casually, maybe borrowing a tool from his garage, completely unaware that you were face to face with a man who had already murdered a string of women. That's exactly what happened. Neighbors later described Franklin as helpful, even friendly. He worked on cars, joked around, showed no signs of being a predator. That's the unsettling thing about killers like him. They don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the guy you wave to in the driveway. This quiet period lulled people into a false sense of security. Without new victims tied to the killings, there was no urgent reason for police to keep pressing. Resources were directed elsewhere. Unsolved files stayed unsolved, and the families who kept demanding justice were often told, in so many words, to wait. But the waiting game was only temporary. Just because the killing stopped didn't mean the predator was cured. Violence like his doesn't fade away. It festers. It waits for the right moment. And after 14 years of eerie quiet, the silence shattered. In 2002, a woman's body was discovered under circumstances that looked eerily familiar to detectives who remembered the 1980s cases. Same kind of victim, same area, same brutal methods. It was like the clock had rewound, and the grim sleeper had simply awakened from his long rest. The city wasn't ready for his return. For nearly a decade and a half, the killings had been out of sight, out of mind. Now, suddenly, the nightmare was back. The first wave had ended with a cliffhanger. The second wave was about to prove that the story was far from over. When 2002 rolled around, Los Angeles was a different city than it had been in the 1980s. The crack epidemic that had ripped through communities had slowed. The streets still bore scars from the riots of the early 90s, and police relations with residents remained shaky at best. But what nobody expected was the return of a predator that many thought had simply vanished. 14 years of silence had made the world forget. And then, as if waking from hibernation, the grim sleeper started hunting again. The first body connected to this second wave was discovered in 2002. A woman, discarded just like those before her, abandoned in a grim echo of the earlier murders. The similarities were undeniable to anyone familiar with the old cases. A vulnerable victim, a neighborhood in South Los Angeles, a body left in a place where someone else would stumble upon it. The police had to wonder, was it possible that the same killer had returned after more than a decade away? At first, detectives were hesitant. Serial killers don't usually stop for so long and then resume. But then, more victims followed. Between 2002 and 2007, at least 6 more women were killed in almost identical fashion. Just like before, they were shot or strangled, often sexually assaulted, their bodies dumped in alleys, dumpsters, or hidden in overgrown lots. For residents of South Los Angeles, the old fear came roaring back like a nightmare that had never really ended. The killings sparked anger in the community. People remembered the 1980s and how little had been done to protect women then. Now it seemed history was repeating itself. Families of the new victims demanded answers. Activists accused the LAPD of dragging its feet, suggesting that if the victims had come from wealthier or whiter neighborhoods, the response would have been faster, louder, and more aggressive. And truthfully, they weren't wrong. The outrage was building. Meanwhile, detectives began revisiting the old files. The 1980s murders and the new cases overlapped too perfectly to ignore. But they needed more than hunches. They needed evidence that could span across decades. And by 2002, the world of forensics had changed. DNA testing had gone from a developing science to a powerful tool, capable of linking crimes across time with pinpoint accuracy. That shift was about to become the game changer in the hunt for the grim sleeper. Back then, each new crime scene yielded DNA samples. Investigators carefully collected them, storing away swabs and traces left behind by the killer. When those samples were compared to older evidence, the results were shocking. They matched. The same man responsible for the deaths in the 1980s was back, continuing his spree nearly 2 decades later. The gap wasn't a coincidence. It was a terrifying pause in a long-running pattern of violence. By 2007, the case had taken on a new urgency. The community's anger reached a boiling point when activists released a flyer, plastered across Los Angeles, that directly accused the LAPD of ignoring a serial killer who was targeting black women. The flyer even coined the nickname that stuck, the Grim Sleeper, a reference to his 14-year break. The pressure on law enforcement was intense. Now they had to deliver results. But even with DNA linking the crimes, they faced a wall. The genetic profile of the killer didn't match anyone in their databases. He had no record, at least not under the DNA system. Detectives were stuck knowing who they were looking for, but not having a name. It was like having a fingerprint with no hand to match it to. Still, the killings painted a disturbing picture. The Grim Sleeper wasn't sloppy. He was deliberate, careful. He targeted women on the margins of society, women less likely to be missed immediately, women whose deaths were less likely to trigger a massive investigation. He dumped their bodies in places that delayed discovery, but always ensured they would eventually be found. That was part of the cruelty. He wanted the world to see the aftermath, but not the act. For families, the second wave of killings was salt in old wounds. Parents who had lost daughters in the 80s watched the news and felt the horror all over again. Mothers who had never seen justice for their children now saw new families stepping into the same nightmare. It was as if time hadn't moved at all. The LAPD, under enormous pressure, created a special task force dedicated solely to catching the Grim Sleeper. Detectives pored over evidence, revisited crime scenes, and looked for any shred of a lead. But the killer remained a ghost. He blended in too well, left behind too little. Even with modern forensics, he seemed untouchable. That was, until technology took a leap forward. In the mid-2000s, forensic labs began using something called familial DNA, searching not just for exact matches in the system, but also for relatives. If your DNA wasn't in the database, but your brother's or your son's was, the system could flag you as a likely suspect. It was a breakthrough that had never been used on a case this big, and it was about to pull the Grim Sleeper out of the shadows. By 2008, detectives knew they were close. They had the DNA trail, the task force, the public support, and the pressure of an entire city demanding justice. The Grim Sleeper had awakened, but what he didn't realize was that the world had awakened too. The same silence that had protected him for 14 years was gone, and this time, there would be no hiding. By the late 2000s, detectives were tired of chasing shadows. They had a mountain of evidence, a string of murders stretching across 2 decades, and DNA that linked everything together. But the problem was clear. They had no name to attach to the genetic profile. The Grim Sleeper's DNA sat in the database, like a ghost signature taunting investigators, but never resolving into an actual suspect. That's when science gave them the break they'd been waiting for. The tool was something relatively new at the time: familial DNA searching. Instead of looking for a perfect match in the database, investigators could now look for near matches, relatives of the killer, who had their DNA on file. Think of it as a genetic ripple effect. If your son or nephew had a brush with the law and their DNA was collected, the system could connect that to you, even if you'd never been swabbed. For the Grim Sleeper case, this technique was revolutionary. The big moment came in 2010. Investigators had been quietly running familial searches when they got a hit, not on the killer himself, but on his son, Christopher Franklin. Christopher's DNA was in the system due to an unrelated arrest, and his profile was close enough to the Grim Sleeper's DNA that detectives knew they were circling in on the family. It meant the killer was likely his father. That's when suspicion turned to Lonnie David Franklin Jr. On the surface, Franklin was nobody's idea of a serial killer. Born in 1952, he grew up in Los Angeles, served in the Army, worked as a mechanic, and was well known in his neighborhood. He fixed cars for friends, attended barbecues, and even helped elderly neighbors with odd jobs. People described him as quiet, polite, almost invisible. He blended in so completely that nobody ever suspected him of being capable of the horrors unfolding around them. But detectives knew better. Once his name landed on their radar, they started digging. Franklin's house was only a few blocks away from where many of the victims had been found. His routine gave him access to vulnerable women in the community, and his past? It wasn't spotless. Franklin had a criminal record that included theft and an assault years earlier. Nothing that screamed serial killer, but enough to suggest he wasn't the picture of innocence he presented to his neighbors. Still, suspicion wasn't enough. The police needed his DNA to prove the connection once and for all. But Franklin was cautious he wasn't about to volunteer a cheek swab. That's when detectives got creative. Undercover officers trailed him, watching his every move, waiting for the moment he'd leave something behind. One night, Franklin ate at a pizza parlor. When he was done, he tossed his utensils and napkin in the trash. What he didn't know was that detectives were already swooping in to collect them. Those discarded items became the smoking gun. Lab tests confirmed what investigators had been chasing for decades. Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s DNA matched the Grim Sleeper profile. The ghost in the database now had a face. After nearly 25 years of hunting, the LAPD had their man. On July 7, 2010, police raided Franklin's South Los Angeles home. The arrest was the kind of scene you see in crime dramas: officers swarming the property, neighbors standing outside in shock, and Franklin himself looking stunned as he was taken away. For the community, it was surreal. The friendly mechanic who lived down the street, the guy who shared beers at block parties, was suddenly unmasked as one of the most prolific serial killers in Los Angeles history. The search of his home revealed a nightmare frozen in time. Investigators found hundreds of photos and videos of women, many of them partially nude or unconscious. Some of these women were later identified as missing persons. Others remain unidentified to this day. The images suggested there could be far more victims than the confirmed list. The sheer scale of what was uncovered was horrifying. It wasn't just murder. It was a meticulous archive of predation. For the families of victims, the discovery was a mix of relief and devastation. Relief that someone was finally caught. Relief that the killings had a face, but devastation that so many lives had been lost while Franklin lived quietly in their midst. The news hit the city like an earthquake. People who had known Franklin for years struggled to reconcile the friendly neighbor with the monster he truly was. To them, he was the guy who'd laugh over car repairs, not the predator who prowled alleys at night. That duality is what made him so dangerous. He wasn't a stranger lurking in the dark. He was hiding in plain sight, wearing the mask of normalcy. The DNA evidence was airtight. The trail of victims stretching from the 1980s through the 2000s was now tied directly to him. For detectives who had spent years staring at cold case files, the moment was vindication. They finally had the answer they'd been chasing through decades of fear, silence, and outrage. But catching him was only the beginning. Ahead lay a trial that would drag every detail of Franklin's crimes into the light. The city would have to confront not only his atrocities, but also the failures that allowed him to go undetected for so long. The grim sleeper had been unmasked. Now came the hard part, proving it in court, and finally delivering justice to the families who had waited decades for it. The arrest of Lonnie Franklin Jr. in July 2010 made headlines across the country, but in South Los Angeles, it felt personal. Neighbors couldn't believe it. The man who fixed their cars, waved to their kids, and lived quietly on 81st Street was being called one of the worst serial killers in California history. To outsiders, it was shocking. To families of the victims, it was both a gut punch and a sigh of relief. The Grim Sleeper finally had a name and a face. What came next was years of preparation for trial. The evidence against Franklin was massive, but so was the scope of his crimes. Prosecutors charged him with 10 counts of murder, spanning from 1985 to 2007, plus 1 count of attempted murder tied to a survivor. The survivor's story was chilling. She had escaped Franklin's grasp in the 1980s, left bleeding but alive. For decades, her account had been brushed aside. Now, it was evidence that he had been hunting all along. The prosecution built its case carefully. They had the DNA evidence, the photographs and videos found in Franklin's home, the ballistics linking his .25 caliber handgun to multiple victims, and the survivor's testimony. Piece by piece, they constructed a picture of a man who preyed on vulnerable women for decades, hid in plain sight, and left a trail of bodies across Los Angeles. Inside his house, detectives had uncovered more than just images. They found jewelry and personal belongings that appeared to have belonged to victims, souvenirs of his crimes. Each piece of evidence was another nail in his coffin. But perhaps the most haunting was the sheer number of photographs, over 1,000 images of women, many of whom were never identified. Some were smiling, some unconscious, others appeared terrified. It raised the terrifying possibility that Franklin's body count was far higher than the 10 murders officially pinned to him. The defense, on the other hand, tried to paint Franklin as a man being railroaded by circumstantial evidence. They argued that the DNA wasn't enough to prove he was responsible for all the killings, that the items in his home didn't directly link him to murder, and that prosecutors were inflating the case to make him into a monster. But the jury wasn't buying it. The survivor's testimony cut through the defense like a knife. She described how Franklin had attacked her, shot her, and left her for dead, only for her to miraculously survive. Sitting in court decades later, she pointed to him as the man who had nearly ended her life. Her presence in the trial was proof that Franklin's crimes weren't just stories from dusty files. They were real. They were brutal. and they had left scars on living people. The trial dragged on for months, with prosecutors presenting forensic experts, detectives, and families of the victims. Jurors heard about how the Grim Sleeper specifically targeted women on the margins, women society often ignored. They heard about how police had overlooked the early killings, treating them as isolated incidents rather than recognizing the serial predator in their midst. And they heard about Franklin's quiet life in his neighborhood, a mask that had fooled everyone. By May 2016, the jury delivered its verdict: guilty on 10 counts of murder, plus attempted murder. Franklin was convicted, officially labeled the Grim Sleeper in the eyes of the court. The next phase was sentencing, and the jury didn't hold back. In June 2016, they recommended the death penalty. During the sentencing, families of the victims finally had the chance to speak. Mothers stood up and described the pain of losing their daughters, of waiting decades for justice, of knowing the man responsible had lived freely all those years. Siblings described the holes left in their families, birthdays missed, memories stolen. Some spoke with anger, others with sorrow, but all of them carried the same message. Lonnie Franklin had destroyed lives, and now he would face the ultimate punishment. The judge upheld the jury's recommendation, and Franklin was officially sentenced to death. For many, it was the closest thing to closure they could hope for. After decades of silence, denial, and waiting, the Grim Sleeper was finally condemned. But the case didn't just end there. The photographs found in his home kept haunting investigators and families alike. Who were all those women? How many more victims were out there, buried, forgotten, their families never knowing what happened? The conviction closed one chapter, but it left lingering questions that may never be answered. The trial also forced Los Angeles to confront its failures. Activists and families pointed out that the Grim Sleeper had been able to operate for so long because of indifference. The victims were Black women, many struggling with poverty or addiction, and their cases didn't receive the same urgency as others might have. The outrage over that neglect wasn't just about Franklin. It was about a system that had allowed him to thrive. For Franklin, the trial was the end of his double life. The neighborly mechanic, the quiet father, the man who blended into the block parties, he was gone. What remained was the predator unmasked, condemned, and caged. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison, placed among the state's most infamous killers. And yet, even behind bars, the story of the Grim Sleeper wasn't over. Lonnie Franklin Jr. sat on death row at San Quentin State Prison, the same prison that once held some of California's most notorious killers. For the families of his victims, knowing he was locked away offered some comfort. But justice, even in the form of a death sentence, rarely erases decades of grief. Franklin never admitted guilt. He didn't explain himself, didn't show remorse, didn't give families the answers they craved. To the end, he remained quiet, almost smug in his silence, as if keeping his secrets gave him one last shred of control. He lived out his years in prison as just another inmate, the horrors of his crimes sealed away in court documents, in photographs, and in the memories of the people he left behind. On March 28, 2020, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was found dead in his cell. He was 67 years old. The cause wasn't immediately released, though there was no sign of foul play. Just like that, the Grim Sleeper was gone. After decades of terror, a long trial, and a death sentence, he slipped quietly out of the world without ever facing the execution chamber. For some, his passing felt like unfinished business. For others, it was enough that he was no longer breathing the same air as free men. The aftermath of the Grim Sleeper case left deep scars, not only for the families of his victims, but for the city of Los Angeles itself. It forced people to reckon with hard questions. Why did it take so long to catch him? Why weren't the murders of vulnerable women treated with urgency from the beginning? Could more lives have been saved if the victims had been valued equally? The outrage that had bubbled during the investigation didn't fade with Franklin's death. Activists continued to point out that the system had failed. The families of women whose photographs were found in Franklin's home still want answers. Some of those women may still be alive, their images captured without consent. Others may represent unknown victims, their deaths never linked to him, their families left in the dark forever. The case also became a lesson in the power and the limitations of forensic science. Without DNA, Franklin might never have been caught. Yet the delay in using that technology meant years of waiting, years in which he was free to live among unsuspecting neighbors. It showed both how far science had come and how much work remained in bridging the gap between communities and law enforcement. For South Los Angeles, the Grim Sleeper's shadow lingers. Streets where bodies were once found carry the weight of memory. Families mark anniversaries of deaths without closure. Some survivors still live with the trauma of escaping his grasp. The story doesn't end with Franklin's arrest or his death. It lives on in the community that endured him. But there's also resilience in that story. Families of the victims, despite years of being ignored, refused to give up. Activists demanded answers when officials stayed quiet. Journalists and community leaders shined a light on the killings when no one else would. Their persistence forced the case back into public view, pressured the LAPD to act, and ultimately played a role in ensuring Franklin faced justice. Without their voices, the Grim Sleeper might have faded into history, another nameless predator never caught. Lonnie Franklin Jr. may be dead, but his crimes serve as a grim reminder. Monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they smile from across the street, wave as they tinker with a car, or sit quietly at neighborhood parties. The real horror of the Grim Sleeper case isn't just the number of lives lost, it's how invisible he managed to be for so long. And now, as the story closes, we're left with a final, uneasy silence. Not the kind Franklin left in 1988, when he paused his killings, but the kind that follows when a predator is finally gone. For the families, that silence carries grief, memory, and the faint echo of justice. For the city, it carries a lesson. Every life matters, and every cry for help deserves to be heard before it's too late. So here we are, at the end of the story of the Grim Sleeper. It began in the alleys and dumpsters of Los Angeles in the 1980s, where women disappeared into the night and were found discarded as if they had never mattered. For years, the killings went unconnected, the victims overlooked, their families left to mourn in silence. Then came the strange, unsettling pause, a 14-year lull where the predator seemed to vanish, only to reappear with the same brutality in the 2000s. The breakthrough came not from luck, but from science. DNA, and later familial DNA, gave investigators the key they needed. From a discarded slice of pizza, the truth unraveled, pointing to Lonnie Franklin Jr., a man hiding in plain sight. The friendly neighbor, the quiet mechanic, the man no one suspected. Inside his home, the photographs and videos told the story of a predator who had never really stopped, who had cataloged his cruelty in chilling detail. His trial brought decades of pain into the light. Families finally spoke, survivors finally had their day, and the jury handed down justice with a death sentence. But Franklin's death in prison in 2020 left many questions unanswered. Who were the women in those photos? How many more victims are still out there, unnamed and unknown? The Grim Sleeper case isn't just about one man's crimes. It's about a system that let him thrive for so long. It's about the value of lives too often ignored, and the strength of families and communities who refuse to let their loved ones be forgotten. And now, as the lights dim and the story fades, we breathe out slowly. The monster is gone, the city still heals, and in the quiet, we hold close the memory of the lives lost, whispering their names into the night. End of script. Have a good night's sleep and sweet dreams.